Hey guys, what's up? Public back with another video, and this is the first video of pre-patch. I felt it was only right to do the pre-patch guide for all of you guys asking. There are a lot of changes for Shadow, not just in how it plays, but also our talent tree. So in this video, I'm going to give you basically the TLDR version of everything you need to know to play Shadow during pre-patch and all that great stuff. Just a quick note, as of releasing this video, the written guide on Icy Veins that I've written is published as well. So feel free, if you want like specific answers to questions, I would definitely check there first. I'm not going to be able to go everything in this video. We've gotten so much stuff. This video would be 5 hours long if I did. So I'm just going to give you kind of high level what you need. But if you want more detail, check out that and all the Discord links in the description. All right, guys, let's jump into things. All right, so starting off this video, let's go over what's changed for Shadow Priest. They did get reworked, so everything that we had has basically been changed from the ground up. The core idea of what it means to be a Shadow Priest is still left intact. They've just built on that idea, right? We're still a dot class. Now we have some more defined cooldowns. Our talent tree gives us some actual real choices. So let's kind of dive into what's changed, starting off with just in general the new spells that we've gotten. So a lot of these guys are going to sound really familiar. They've given us a lot of us like old talents we've liked or old spells baseline of the spec, which is cool. So Devouring Plague is returned as a core spell. It's actually like the big chunk of our damage now. So they've kind of reworked our damage pattern basically into Devouring Plague. It's going to be like 30% plus of your damage. It's big. They've also given us Shadow Word Death baseline back from being a talent. Again, kind of harking back to what we've had in the past. We have a few new passives. So Dark Thoughts is a new passive here. And basically what this is it's kind of playing off a bit on our mastery, which we'll get into in just a second. But basically they put Shadowy Insight, which used to be a level 15 talent, and kind of made it baseline to the spec. So as you play the spec normally, you do your Mind Flays on a target that has dots on it. You have a chance to get a free Mind Blast proc, which is pretty neat. We'll go over what that means in the rotation section, but effectively it's just giving you something to kind of interrupt the daily kind of rotation of just doing a filler and making that filler a bit more exciting is the plan here. Playing off of that, we did get a brand new mastery. So our mastery before, we've always kind of complained that it was kind of boring, didn't really fit the theme of the spec, and no one really paid attention to it. They've heard a lot of that cries. They haven't done anything super substantial to it, although I think this is enough to kind of play a bit more into the strengths of what Shadow likes to be good at. So our damage is increased by X% for each of our dot effects on a target, and during Void Form, you get that full benefit, which is the cool part. So effectively, so right now on this character, I have enough mastery to give me 10% increased damage, right? So that means if I have all 3 dots active on a target, I do 30% more damage to that target with most of my abilities. Not everything's on it. And then again, when I'm in Void Form, I get that benefit regardless of if I have all 3 of those dots on a target, which is really, really great for AoE when it's a little bit harder to spread all of our dots to all of our targets. And going a bit forward, we have a few more passives. They also rework Shadowy Apparitions. So when you use your Mind Blast, Devouring Plague, or Void Bolt, you now spawn a shadowy version of yourself. We've had this in the past, but now it's kind of just there's nothing here. It's just direct. You get that apparition on every cast, as long as that target has Vampiric Touch currently ticking on it. So they definitely played a lot more into Vampiric Touch specifically. It used to be kind of Shadow Word Pain focused. Now getting actual VTs up on as many targets as possible is very valuable. And the kind of double here is they kind of still had to tie in crit a little bit. So critical strikes cause 2 apparitions to spawn. So if you have Vampiric Touch up on a target, you Mind Blast it, and that Mind Blast crits, you spawn 2 apparitions, right? So that's how it works. In pre-patch is going to be pretty monstrous because we have an Azerite trait that buffs these apparitions. It's going to be pretty spicy. We'll get to that in just a second. And the last kind of thing I want to touch on here, you've probably seen if you looked at some of the coverage, we do have Power Infusion back to the spec at some point, although in pre-patch we will not have it. Power Infusion is a cooldown coming back to us, but we won't get that until Shadowlands. So we also did get 2 additional spells, Desperate Prayer back baseline to the spec, which does just kind of like an on-demand heal and a little bit of a defensive, which is great. And we do have Mind Soothe coming as well, as you can see over here. Don't have that quite yet. So yeah, that's kind of the short TLDR version of what's changed. I skipped over Devouring Plague because I wanted to cover that very specifically. So Devouring Plague, this is the big change with the spec. We're kind of going back to that traditional builder spender style of the spec, with Void Form also getting significant changes. So instead of us kind of now bobbing in and out of Void Form throughout the course of a fight, Void Form is now a cooldown, right? It's not something that you're just going to be in all the time anymore. Actually, quite the opposite. You're only in Void Form for the high peaks of your damage now. And that's kind of a little bit of the rework coming into the Shadow Priest. So because of that, they had to change things a little bit because, well, it wasn't really that exciting if you didn't have anything to use that insanity on. So now we are a builder spender spec. So we still have the same spells that generate us insanity, like Mind Blast and Mind Flay, but now we have Devouring Plague to spend insanity. Very, very similar to kind of how the Shadow Word playstyle worked in WoD. We have Devouring Plague that costs 50 insanity, right? And it deals instant damage to the target, quite a lot I might add, and then applies a dot for 6 seconds to the target. Now, the very interesting part of this dot is it actually rolls damage over. So we'll get into that in just kind of a bit, but what that means is Devouring Plague is a very, very intelligent, smart dot. Works unlike anything else you've ever seen in the game, and it's there to make sure that you get the right damage every time you cast it, and you're never losing damage by recasting it. Because it is kind of a dot, right? So if you recasted a dot that costed something, you would have missed out on that damage. But what they've done is all of the damage of an old dot, when you refresh Devouring Plague, gets added to the new dot, which is really, really interesting. And effectively means we're not going to lose damage. Now, the key to that, though, is you don't actually want to, keep refreshing all the time, because we do still care about having dot uptime of the spec because of our mastery. If you kind of burst all of your Devouring Plague and all of your Insanity to this giant big Devouring Plague, yeah, you'll do a lot of great burst damage if that's what you want, but you'll end up losing mastery uptime because, again, we want to keep our dots up as much as possible. So that's kind of how the spec basically works. Let's kind of dive into what that looks like on Voidform specifically. All right, guys, we are back in the garrison once again. So as I mentioned before, Voidform is now a cooldown, right? So I can hover over Void Eruption now. Void Eruption is still the thing that puts you into Voidform, but now it's a 1.5 minute cooldown baseline, and you actually get that Voidform buff for a static 15 seconds. So if I cast it right there, you can see I actually have the PvP talent active, so I went ahead and smashed everything with all my targets. And I have this Voidform buff that's now ticking down in the last 15 seconds. And you can see here from the tooltip, I get spell damage dealt increased by 20%, which is actually just a 10% bump because I have Shadow Form otherwise. So while you're in Void Form, I do 10% more damage. And keep in mind, with our Mastery, I get that full benefit of the Mastery. So everything's kind of playing on top of each other. And because of the talents, there's actually a whole talent row to add more stuff to Voidform in general. So you saw there's a crit bonus there. That's from a talent. We'll get to that in just a second. The other big part of Voidform that wasn't very clear right there is, well, baseline, I only have 1 charge of Mind Blast, right? We used to have a talent that did give me 2 charges, but they've now since changed that. And when you're inside of Voidform, you get 2 charges baseline. So instead of kind of making that 2 charges Mind Blast playstyle baseline all the time, they just kind of bake that into Voidform to give us that nice little compromise there, right? So once I go into Voidform, you get 2 charges of Mind Blast, and it resets the cooldown, which is pretty great. And the other thing that's still there, you still get access to Void Bolt that does still work almost exactly the same as it does now. It refreshes Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch. Does not refresh Devouring Plague, though. That guy you're on your own for. Other than that, guys, Voidform is the kind of new cooldown to the spec. So a lot of big, crazy changes. To kind of finish explaining what this actually means from the rotation, let's go over the actual talents and everything that's changed there. All right, so the biggest change, in my opinion, that actually makes Shadow a joy to play right now, in addition to all the great changes I've already mentioned, the talent tree, they did a number of great things here. So let's go over row by row what they've changed and kind of what that means. So real quick, 15 row, Fortress of the Mind, basically the same. Nothing's really changed here. The value of the spells has changed, though, so keep that in mind. They've removed Shadowy Insight. As I said, that thing is basically baseline now with the Dark Thoughts passive. We have Death and Madness here instead. So because we have Shadow Word Death baseline, they've given us this talent to augment Shadow Word Death in Death and Madness. So what it does is, if you snipe a target with Shadow Word Death, meaning after using Death, if it dies within 6 or 7 seconds, I think, you actually reset the cooldown on Shadow Word Death, and you get a big chunk of 40 Insanity over the course of 4 seconds, which makes this an open world and Mythic Plus absolute monster of a talent to play with. It's a lot of fun. Just got to be a little careful, though, because Shadow Word Death does have pushback damage, so you do get the benefit because they're in execute range. It does more damage when it's in execute, but you still take that damage, so be careful not to kill yourself with this. They also, like I said, removed Shadow Word Void, which was that talent we basically took all of the time and effectively made it baseline inside of Void Form. Instead, we have this new talent called Unfurling Darkness. So what this is, it's kind of an interesting spell to play around with. I know a lot of people are kind of have like mixed feelings on it a little bit, but effectively what it does is gives you a little bit of extra damage while you're multi-dotting. So if I cast Vampiric Touch on a target, I get a free instant cast Vampiric Touch cast. I have only 8 seconds to use it. And then it hits that second target with a full Vampiric Touch and then deals a large chunk of initial damage. The only caveat is that can only occur, I think, every 15 seconds right now. So you can see there was a little debuff I had on my target. Now it's ready for me to do that again. So if you get full uptime, you're actually going to get a ton of damage out of this. We do have to refresh our dots a bit more often now than we used to because we don't have access to Void Bolt all the time. So you actually get quite a lot of value of Unfurling Darkness in those kind of AoE scenarios when you're redotting anyway. So this is going to be a very interesting kind of like a raid talent to take when there's lots of ads coming in and out and Fortress doesn't make sense. right, so moving on, level 25 row, no changes here. I won't cover this too much. I generally like to take body and soul for most stuff. It's just personal preference, although the other two options can make sense depending on what you're doing. Level 30 row, again, not a whole lot of changes here. Twist of Fate, Misery, exactly the same. Although now we don't have access to Void Bolt all the time. Redotting has become a much more like back into our rotation, like a big staple. So having Misery is actually pretty great because we're redotting a lot more often. This makes it that much easier. So that part's really great. And again, still great for that spread target dotting. Now, this is one of the biggest changes here. They've actually removed Dark Void and replaced it with something very, very similar called Searing Nightmare. So Searing Nightmare is an AoE spender of insanity, right? So we do have Devouring Plague that costs insanity. We also have Searing Nightmare. So right now it costs 35 insanity. It did cost 30 on beta, so they did make that a little bit higher. I'm unsure which one's supposed to be intended. But basically, this kind of has twofold, right? So similar to Dark Void, if I get, let me get enough insanity real quick. Okay, great, I have 35 insanity. Now, I can only cast this while I'm channeling Mindseer, right? So if I just click it right now, must be channeling Mindseer to cast it, right? So that does kind of limit its full potential, and I think it makes it a little bit easier to balance, but once I'm channeling Mindseer, I can cast it, and you can see it spreads Shadow Word Pain to all targets hit, which is really, really exciting. Now, the double part of this, if a target is already affected by Shadow Word Pain, it deals twice as much damage to that target and refreshes Shadow Word Pain, which is honestly just flipping awesome. It's very interesting to play with in dungeons. I have a lot of fun with it. And so you can see if I get enough insanity here, depending on your haste levels, it's going to be kind of weird to plan, but you can get just about sometimes 3 casts of Searing Nightmare per Mindseer channel. They did make the channel duration a bit longer, although I'd suggest only ever doing 2 in a single channel. It's just much more consistent, easier to pull off. So if we do a Mindseer here and kind of hit spam our Searing Nightmare button, you can see I got the 2 casts off there. Lots of big damage, and the greatest part about this is it's uncapped damage. So a lot of spells got capped AoE in the pre-patch for Shadowlands. This spell did not. So that's going to be honestly a lot of fun to play with in dungeons, so really looking forward to that. Misery still might make sense depending on the dungeon and how spread out targets are, but Searing Nightmare will be that go-to talent we'll use almost all the time in dungeons. Moving on here, level 35 row. Again, no real changes here. Sad to say, I wish there was, but that's okay. They couldn't get to everything. Next up, level 40 row. A couple interesting things here to talk about. So Auspicious Spirits here has a little bit different value because they reworked our actual shadowy apparitions. So we do have a much more consistent amount of shadowy apparitions that we get. It's not very reliant on having a lot of crit to spawn these guys. So the value of this talent actually is much more consistent than it was before. We typically were using AS towards the end of an expansion, but now it's probably going to be one of those like set it and forget it talents still. We'll talk about that in just a second, because our other 2 options are interesting: Psychic Link and Shadow Crash. So Shadow Crash was already there. It's been reworked though, so it's a little different now. So it's a little funky. I'm not quite sure what their goal here with this spell is, but it's it has 3 charges now, so it's kind of interesting. So instead of only having a single Shadow Crash that you use kind of regularly, you have 3. So I can go 1, 2. There we go. I had to wait for the GCD, and there's the 3rd one. Now, they all kind of recharge their cooldowns independently, so it does take quite a while to get all 3 of them back. But it is a hasted cooldown, which is interesting. It does a little bit of AoE damage, but really not that much, and that's kind of the biggest problem with it right now. Tuning-wise, it's not very strong. They did also put a single target element to the talent, which is interesting, in that if Shadow Crash hits a lone target, they suffer 35% increased damage from the next Shadow Crash within 15 seconds. Effectively meaning if you put all 3 Shadow Crashes onto the same target and single target, that's like very optimal. It'll do more damage that way because they will continue to stack up on each other. Again, that doesn't work in AoE, just kind of a single target thing, but not bad. It does do a lot of insanity, but again, the cooldown's kind of long, so you're not actually casting this that very often, so I don't know, it's not doing that great. I hope they change it a little bit, but we'll see what happens. Now, the other talent that we have is Psychic Link. This is where things get interesting. This used to be a PvP talent. Now it's back in PvE world. The tuning on this is still going to be a little interesting because it kind of overlaps a little bit with the strengths of Auspicious Spirits, which means we're not taking it very often right now, but it could be really strong in these any kind of like spread target fights, especially when you only have a few of them, but we'll see. So what it does is Mind Blast deals half of its damage to all other targets afflicted by your Vampiric Touch within 40 yards. So you're already casting Vampiric Touch on everything to get those AS procs, to get extra mastery bonus, all that great stuff. So this kind of plays around with that, and you can kind of see a build starting here with, oh, I'll take Unfurling Darkness, Misery, Psychic Link, go really ham into Vampiric Touch, and get that extra Mind Blast damage, which is great. The problem is, Mind Blast just doesn't do that much damage. This talent isn't that valuable, and again, it shares a lot of stuff with AS, so we're not taking it that much right now, but obviously they can still do a lot more tuning before we get into Shadowlands. Okay, moving on to the level 45 row. Again, a new talent here, Lingering Insanity, which Lingering Insanity was here before. That has been removed. We now have Damnation. So PvPers are rejoicing over this talent. It's pretty awesome for that. It's good in open world as well. It's very, very simple. Use it on a target, and it puts all 3 of your dots on that target. Easy peasy. It's pretty great. Now, again, because of the way Devouring Plague works and then it rolls its damage over, you can actually do some monster burst with this. If you get 100 Insanity, do 2 Devouring Plagues back to back. That means that second Devouring Plague is ticking much harder than the first one. You can then do Damnation right afterwards and basically get a 3-stack Devouring Plague ticking very, very hard for that full 6 seconds, which is going to be pretty great in PvP. PvE use cases, not that much. Again, you're losing mastery uptime by using all those kind of in a row, one at a time, to get the burst damage. So the trade-off there is going to be dependent on what you want to do. Like, if you really want to kill a target, it's going to be great. But outside of that, So the PvE use cases of Damnation aren't that large, but it is there as an option. Mindbender, however, this is going to be, it's basically the same as it was now. It's just Shadow Fiend's a terrible cooldown, so Mindbender just makes a terrible cooldown a little bit less sucky, and it's just kind of generally universal, so we're using this quite a lot right now. And then Void Torrent is the other option here. They reworked this slightly because it did kind of had some play into effects with the old Insanity Drain mechanic that's no longer there. So Void Torrent still has the same awesome animation that we're used to. Boom, crazy awesome. It is a little buggy, as you can see. It's supposed to apply Devouring Plague to your target and then refresh Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch every tick of it. That part obviously is not working super well right now, but hopefully we get those bugs ironed out before we get this onto the live servers. Now, right now, this talent is not super competitive. I have a feeling they're going to tune it to be a very great single target ability, but we'll see where that comes and competes in with Mindbender. We'll see what happens. Okay, in the last row, the level 50 row, this is where the real fun stuff happens. They basically reworked this entire row. It's completely different now. So starting off with Ancient Madness, so this is what I was showing you guys earlier. This is the kind of like burst void form option. So it actually gives you a kind of a crit buff at the start of void form that fades gradually over time as void form fades out. So void form increases your crit chance by 30% for 15 seconds, reducing 2% every second. So if you do choose to get my weak ore, which is linked in the description if you need it, you can actually see this bonus ticking down right here. So you see every second you're losing that 2% chance, which means, again, you're getting a very burstier void form, which is really cool to play with. So depending on what you're doing, you pull a giant large pack of Mythic Plus or whatever, this is going to be a great talent for that. It's kind of the like catch-all option, so you'll kind of use this talent if the other two don't make sense. It doesn't have a whole interaction with our playstyle, which is why that really helps for that. So kind of moving on here, Hungering Void, this is the other option we have. So this is the newest option that we've gotten. I haven't had as much time to test it because, again, it is brand new. It just started working on beta like a week ago, so here we are. Void Bolt causes the target to be vulnerable to the void, causing them to take increased damage for you by 10% for 6 seconds. You can only have that effect on one target at a time, though. So if you Void Bolt target A, it gets the debuff. If you Void Bolt target B, that debuff gets removed from the first target, moves to the second one. So it's kind of like a priority target, single target debuff is part one. Part two is if you cast a subsequent Void Bolt on a target that has that debuff, the duration of Void Form is actually extended by 1 second, or 2 seconds if that Void Bolt crits. So this playstyle is very, very interesting. So typically, again, our Void Forms are static at 15 seconds. Using this, you can easily get like 20, 25 second Void Forms depending on how much you crit, which is pretty interesting. So it's kind of more about, you know, instead of having a burstier Void Form, I'm going to have a longer sustained single target effect burst on a single target. And just a quick note, that 10% damage increase here right now affects kind of everything. It's still kind of wonky with pets. It's only your damage specifically that it's buffing, but that does apply to things like trinkets and potions and that kind of stuff, which could be overpowered. We'll see what happens. But so if we go in here, You can see you get a debuff on the target there, so then any subsequent Void Bolts here you can see are adding a second or two to my Voidform duration. And in total, as you get more haste, that's going to help you get more Void Bolts out, which is good. Or if it crits, again, that extends Void Form. So again, you can get, especially with a lot of great pre-patch gear, you can get some pretty good results out of this, extending Void Form by, you know, upwards of 10, 15 seconds, depending on how lucky you are, which is a pretty interesting play style. So again, this will probably be that like go-to single target talent. Right now, it's pretty overpowered. We're going to use it quite a lot, I think, in the raid tier, but it's going to be a fun addition, especially if you're kind of longing for that old playstyle, like pushing against the grain a little bit. It's not quite the same, but it is something a little reminiscent to what we had before. So there we go. Okay, and last but certainly not least, I just did a full video on this guy, as well as Hungering Void, if you want to check those guys out. We have Surrender to Madness, a very different version of Surrender to Madness, but still harkens back to the old days where we used to accidentally die all the time in Emerald Nightmare. So Surrender to Madness is basically a second Void Form, is a good way to look at it. So using it on a target, you cast Void Eruption on whatever target you use it on, and you go into Void Form, right? So you effectively get a second Void Form. Now, the trick here is you have 25 seconds for that target to die, otherwise you die instead. So you kind of have to game this a little bit, and this gets a lot easier if you have like more controlled targets. So again, if you're in Mythic Plus, there's mobs dying all the time. This talent gets really, really strong, which is very fun. In raiding, this is going to be kind of a bit more of a skill thing to when to use it, because if there's an ad in a fight on a raid, this is going to be very easy to use on that ad to get that extra Void Form. The trick is you want to make sure it's just lined up correctly to get the most value out of it. Now, the other part of this talent, for the duration of that debuff being on a target, right, you have that 25-second timer. For that duration, you get to cast while moving, and you generate 100% more insanity from your abilities. Again, which means more Devouring Plagues, easier to move. I mean, it's awesome. But again, you have to kill that target within 25 seconds or you die. So it's not that bad to play with. I know a lot of you guys are probably freaking out. Again, I did a whole video kind of explaining this a little bit more in detail if you're curious. But basically, to get the most value out of this, you just need the target to live for like a second. Like, use it when it has 5% health. You're going to get the most uptime here, because using it, you still get that Void Form even if that target dies, right? So obviously I can't use it on the target dummy here or I would die, but let's say the target dummy is going to die in 2 seconds. I use it, I get the Void Form, I have a 15-second Void Form now. The target dies 2 seconds into my Void Form. I keep the Void Form, I'm still there. I just lose that Insanity Generation and cast while moving part. So yeah, a lot of great options here in the talent tree. I'm sure I missed a few things, but I think the choice we have here is really my favorite part of Shadow going into pre-patch. So now just really quickly, let's go over some quick builds. And again, the Icy Veins guide, I've gone on this a bit more detail if you're curious. But from a rating perspective, you're probably going to want to go something with like Fortress of the Mind, Body and Soul, Twist of Fate, you know, last word, use whatever you want here. AS is probably going to be the go-to. Mindbender, and then this last row is going to be very dependent on what you're able to do. I would say for the most part, you're probably going to pick Hungering Void here. But if there's ever a fight that's like maybe more AoE focused, like Hive Mind, Ancient Madness would probably make more sense. Or if you feel comfortable, Surrender to Madness to snipe on those ads. This is going to be kind of that fluid part of the rotation or the talent tree here. And the other choice you're going to want to make between stuff is on the level 30 row. So Twist of Fate, that's basically your pure single target talent. Misery is also pretty good for single target, but usually Twist of Fate is edging it out. Although Misery, anytime you have consistent waves of spread ads, is going to be great. And then Searing Nightmare is that stacked AoE kind of cleave option. So you're pretty much only going to use Searing Nightmare on fights like Hive Mind and that kind of stuff, or Mythic Plus. Otherwise, Misery is going to be used in probably almost every fight in Nyalotha in this pre-patch environment, but we'll see what happens. As far as this top row, I think Fortress is probably going to be the play on most fights, although we'll see what plays out. Unfurling Darkness could make sense on a few, but we'll see. I would say you're probably okay with Fortress on most things, though. And then for Mythic Plus on that flip side of the coin, Death and Madness is total bread and butter here. Unfurling Darkness could be good as well. Kind of depends on what the key is you're doing and how consistently you can get these death snipes off. So either one of these options is going to be good, although Death and Madness is just a lot of fun to play with. Personally, again, I usually use Body and Soul, but Sand Land can be great if you can make use of that. Between Misery and Searing Nightmare, you're going to basically use Searing Nightmare all the time from a dungeon perspective. Misery will make sense if you're pulling much smaller packs that are living quite long, especially if they're not stacked. It doesn't happen a lot in the existing keys that we have, but for sure, keys like King's Rest, where there isn't a ton of stacked AoE, Misery could make more sense there. Obviously, Misery has much more value single target than Searing Nightmare does. So kind of keep that in mind on a key-to-key basis, but Searing Nightmare is going to be very nice to have, especially since it's uncapped AoE. Again, you're going to take AS basically all the time. Bender, again, probably going to take it all the time. And then for Mythic Plus, Surrender to Madness is going to be my personal go-to, although there will be specific options where Hungering Void will make sense on like Tyrannical, where you really just care about sustained boss damage. Hungering Void is going to be really great for that. Or if there's kind of a mix of where you want your damage, you can always do Ancient Madness and get a giant big burst to your Void form. This is going to be great for those of you that like to pull like 5 packs at a time and just nuke the crap out of it with everyone's cooldowns. This is the talent for you on that guy. But otherwise, Surrender to Madness basically will give you Void form more consistently throughout the dungeon. So you can use Void form on one pack and then Surrender to Madness on the next pack is kind of how that works out. So those are the kind of builds that we're going to go over in pre-patch. So hope that makes sense. And again, check the guide in the description if you want some more breakdowns of stuff. All right. Okay, so that is the talents. So let's kind of go over briefly Azerite and Essences stuff before we move on to the rotation. All right, so as you guys know, we're in pre-patch. Things are being kind of a very wacky state. That is definitely true for Azerite traits and Essences that we have. So I'll quickly kind of go over things to look for and pitfalls to avoid. So first things first, with our Azerite, everyone take off Chorus of Insanity. Chorus of Insanity is basically useless. It's kind of funny how I went from being like our best trait to the worst. They haven't changed it since the Voidform rework, so it's effectively useless, and you should never use it under any circumstances whatsoever. It just gives you 1 stack of the crit buff. It's pretty terrible. So on the flip side, though, with the Shadowy Apparitions reworking and how everything works, the Spiteful Apparitions trait is going to be very, very strong. So whatever you can do to get 3 of those guys, that's what you want to do. Luckily, the Carapace and N'Zoth helm and shoulders that we have, we'll go over that real quick. Oops, that's Castle Nathria, have our best traits on them by a long shot. So if we go to Carapace real quick, we have these shoulders on it. So you have Spiteful Apparitions here. We would normally take Chorus, but instead we can take Heart of Darkness, which just increases our secondary stats, which is pretty great. And then we still get the increased eye level and all that other great stuff, right? And then same thing with N'Zoth here. You can use the Helm and get Spiteful Apparitions and Heart of Darkness. Now, the only thing here you want to keep in mind is that, well, we have that third piece, right? And there are basically no good chest pieces inside of the raid. I think Rod Dens is like the one that would be okay. You can go Whispers and then Heart of Darkness here. It's okay, but again, you miss out on that triple Spiteful Apparition. So you might already have it. There are a few, I think there's 2 chest pieces actually from Mythic Plus that you can get where you can go Whispers and Spiteful Apparitions. Getting that 1 Whispers trait is really strong. Also, just stacking Whispers is good as well, although Whispers versus Heart of Darkness kind of depends on what you can find, so keep that in mind. So that's kind of your ideal setup, is get 3 SA and then get whatever the heck else, as long as it's not Chorus of Insanity. Whispers, Heart of Darkness are your kind of 2 and 3 traits right there. Now, as far as Essences go, things are kind of in a weird state. Honestly, I've been so focused on doing Shadowlands simming. I haven't done a whole lot of simming for Essences and traits and all that kind of stuff. We do know a couple things just from doing a bit of like preliminary stuff. So for the most part, Condensed Life Force is going to be your bread and butter from a major essence perspective for a lot of people that play the game. It's the easiest thing to use with their spec. A lot of you guys are already used to using it, so using this from a rating perspective is going to be really, really strong. Memory of Lucid Dreams could still be decent, although again, I haven't put as much time to playing with it. It's still, the major still works the same, so you get more Insanity generation, although we don't need that in Void form because we're already kind of flooded with Insanity, so this is only kind of like an off Void form button, but it could be better if you want kind of a smoother damage profile. The other major essence I'll kind of give like an honorable mention to is World Vein Resonance. So we love primary stat now. Intellect is very, very strong with the kind of redistribution of stats. This actually gets a lot better, although it is kind of awkward to play with because it's a minute cooldown, Void Form's a minute and a half, so lining it up is a bit challenging, but again, honorable mention, it's something to definitely keep in mind if you want to play around and really min-max the crap out of pre-patch. Go for it, be my guest. As far as minor essences go, everything's pretty similar. Lucid Miner is the only weird one. So the way Lucid Miner works is kind of, it's very wacky. It's effectively still giving you random insanity refunds, but it's kind of, the way that it works is just, it's too weird to explain. This doesn't fully work in SimC, although we did make a pretty good guess. So if you're simming yourself in pre-patch, kind of keep that in mind. It's just kind of a rough approximation of how it would work. Although for the most part, I think a lot of you guys will be pretty well off running with Breath of the Dying as one of your miners, running Focused Azerite Beam as that second miner, and the third one, it's either going to be Lucid or actually Crucible of Flame Miner, just because of all the stats changes is doing very, very well, so I would slot that in. So from a rating perspective, I'd put Condensed Life Force there, pick up Essence of the Focusing Iris Minor, go Crucible right there, and then grab Breath of the Dying. This is a pretty good setup for most of the raid content. And then the only thing you really want to swap out here, if you go into Mythic Plus, Essence of the Focusing Iris is still really, really strong for Mythic Plus. So slot that bad boy in there. Maybe go Formless Void as that third minor slot, or you could also go Blood of the Enemy if you have that. Kind of up to you what makes the most sense and how you pull. Either one of them is going to be very, very good options. All right, guys. And I almost forgot I was about to edit this video. I didn't talk about stats. I didn't talk about this because I wanted to make sure that you guys are simming your characters. I can't tell you what the best stats are for every character in the game. I can tell you, generally speaking, we really love Intellect right now. After that, Haste is kind of that second stat we really, really like. And then you kind of want everything else kind of equally. Now, with the Azerite traits running, all that good stuff, crits value is very high as well. The only thing you want to keep in mind is, though, we do have diminishing returns with our stats now. So once you get above 30% of haste, crit, or versatility, they start to diminish their value in terms of like how much points you need for 8% of a stat. So if you are sitting at 30% haste, adding more haste is probably not going to be the answer you want to go to. You probably want to put that stat into something else if you can do that, like change an enchant, that kind of thing. Now, that point does not exist there for Mastery. So for Mastery, we have a half-point conversion rating. So that would be at 15% for us, but we do have 4% Mastery baseline. So that same point will happen at Mastery around 19%, all right? So keep that in mind. Sim your character, check your enchants, and then you'll know what stats are best for you. All right, guys? Good luck. So let's quickly move on to the rotation section of all you need to know for the pre-patch. All right, so let's talk about your rotation. It's not going to be that complex. I'm just kind of going to go over this briefly. A lot of it's going to be coming down to keep your dots up on as many targets as possible, and then build Insanity, spend with Devouring Plague. That's your bread and butter for this rotation. So while you're doing this, you do want to start opening with Vampiric Touch now. Mind Blast value has tanked a little bit, so open up with Vampiric Touch, get Shadow Word Pain up on the target, Mind Blast that target, then go right into casting all of your cooldowns. So if you have Shadow Fiend, Mindbender, use that. And then we have no ramp to our damage anymore. You can just go right into Void Eruption. So right off pull, right when you get lost, all that great stuff, go ahead and use Void Eruption. You do want about like 30 or 40 Insanity when you're using Void Eruption, just to make sure that the first Void Bolt into Void Form, you get enough Insanity to cast Devouring Plague right away to get that damage boost, like uptime efficiently. And then for the most part, you're kind of doing two things. You are building as much Insanity as possible and keeping dot uptime for Mastery purposes. So the big key there is don't refresh Devouring Plague unless you have to. Yes, the damage does roll over, but we want maximum uptime for Mastery. So what you do is, unless you're going to cap Insanity, which means you're going, either above 100 or really close to 100, don't cast Devouring Plague until it has like 1 or 2 seconds left. Don't really worry about the pandemic refreshing thing. That's a complex question and answer I'll handle later. But effectively, you don't really have to worry about that. Just kind of keep it up as much as you can, and then you'll do great from there. Now, if you're about to cap Insanity, feel free to dump all of that Insanity into Devouring Plague. You're not going to lose damage. It's very much a good thing. And that's kind of what you want to do. Now, as far as a couple other kind of caveats here, just go over my list of things I want to mention. So you do still want to make sure that you're filling with Mind Flay on one target. If you're fighting more than one target, 2 or more, generally speaking, you want to use Mind Seer. From a damage perspective, it could be advantageous to start doing that at 3 instead because of the Insanity generation of just doing Mind Flay single target. But generally, you can just swap that over at 2 targets and you're going to be okay. You get a lot of benefits from doing that, both from Dark Thoughts, procs, and otherwise, so keep that in mind. Now, as far as Shadow Word Death is concerned, you do have the ability to cast it whenever you want. It just does increased damage below 20%. So from a single target perspective, you pretty much only want to cast it when the target is below 20%. Although if you're also kind of on the move, obviously we don't have Void Bolt to Stutter Step anymore. You can use Shadow Word Death as one of those globals to help you move instead of just spamming Shadow Word Pain or Power Word Shield. So that's how that'll work. As far as any talents that would modify this a little bit, if you're using Infernal Darkness, make sure you're using that sucker on cooldown. Every 15 seconds, get a weak aura like mine or a different one to make sure you're getting the most uptime there. Other talents I want to mention, again, Shadow Crash. If you're going to use this talent, for the most part, using it in Void Form is kind of a trap. It's only really there for outside of Void Form. The same holds true with Void Torrent. You're using like 3-4 seconds inside of Void Form to not cast Devouring Plague is a trap. So these talents are kind of weird in that you pretty much only want to use them when you're not in Void Form to help generate more Devouring Plague key with that uptime. Shadow Crash on single target, pretty much only use the charges if you have all of them. You can start casting it when that second charge, or sorry, excuse me, when the third charge is almost up. You can start casting the second, the first, and the second, and the third, because the cooldown will be up. Again, I don't really recommend taking it, but if you want to try it out, that's how you want to do that. And then last but not least, with Surrender to Madness, again, try and get the most out of sniping and ad with it, but be very, very careful. And that's for the most part, guys. That's the single target rotation. There's really not much else to it. Use your cooldowns on cooldown. The one thing I'll mention is be a little careful with Void Bolt. Void Bolt's priority has fallen quite dramatically just because Devouring Plague is so important. So make sure you're prioritizing, no matter what you're doing, Devouring Plague. Devouring Plague is your best friend. So if you have Void Bolt off cooldown, but you also need to use Devouring Plague because it's either A, not on the target, or you're going to cap Insanity with Void Bolt, you need to press Devouring Plague instead. Ideally, you line things up to where you never have that situation and you always use Void Bolt on cooldown, ideally. But again, Devouring Plague is the most important thing in the world to you. Make sure you don't forget that. Okay, guys, multi-target rotation time. This is going to be really easy. You're going to press Mind Seer, and you're going to generate as much Insanity as possible. And then if you're taking Searing Nightmare, you're going to use Searing Nightmare. And that's, for the most part, your rotation. I'm kind of joking in that, honestly, Searing Nightmare is so powerful. That's a lot of what your AoE rotation is going to revolve around if you're using it. The only kind of caveat to what you want to think about, and this is the hardest thing to do, is when to cast Vampiric Touch or when to dot things kind of in general. So a couple things to keep in mind. From a Searing Nightmare perspective, you don't start using Searing Nightmare over Devouring Plague until about 3 or 4 targets. Again, kind of depends on what your mastery and your stats are looking at, but 3 to 4 targets is kind of the mark where you're like, okay, instead of using Devouring Plague, I'm going to use Searing Nightmares instead. But on that 2 target, for sure, keep up your Devouring Plagues. It's only when you get past that to where you can really start making that decision. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that having Vampiric Touch on as many targets as possible will buff Searing Nightmare's damage because of the mastery. So as much as you can, try to keep Vampiric Touch on targets, even in AoE. Just be careful that you're not costing yourself uptime or damage. So it is kind of helpful to weave that in as you're generating Insanity and kind of holding off for those Dark Thought procs to help with, again, Spiteful Insanity generation, all that great stuff, right? So do kind of keep that in mind. Vampiric Touch is really the only question mark there. As far as other things, for the most part, Void Torrent is not going to help you out on AoE. Don't worry about it. Shadow Crash's AoE is not better than you just using Searing Nightmare, so it's generally not ever worth it to take that talent in AoE. I know it sounds like it might be worth it, but again, Searing Nightmare and Mind Seer, that's your bread and butter right now. Really, whatever you can to optimize that, that's really all you got to do. I will say you do want to kind of save all of that burst. We are a cooldown spec now, so you do kind of want to think about when to use your cooldowns in AoE, right? Are you going to use Voidform for this pack? Or are you going to maybe save it for the next one because it's bigger? Are you taking Surrender? Can you use Voidform this pack? Use Surrender on the next one. And again, kind of planning out, that's going to be really helpful. When you have Surrendered up, all that Insanity generation you're getting just means you can get out much more Searing Nightmares. You might cap Insanity a little bit depending on how many targets you're fighting, but as long as you're pumping out Searing Nightmares, you're going to do really, really solid damage. Just that question of when you want to do Vampiric Touch. Now, with Misery, if you decide to use that again, once you start dipping into that kind of, again, 3-4 target territory, that's where it probably would have been better to use Searing Nightmare for that pull. But if it's 2 or 3 targets and that's all it's ever going to be, Misery is going to be a pretty solid choice there. And for the most part, if you're taking Misery, you have no excuse to keep up all of your dots up on all targets at all times. There's kind of a question of when you're going to use Devouring Plague or not. You'll keep using Devouring Plague if you're using Misery up to like infinite targets, so don't worry about that. But just make sure you have the other dots up there as well, and still fill with Mind Seer as much as possible. Mind Seer in and of itself, even with Misery, is going to do a lot of your damage, so keep that in mind. And again, last but not least, Death and Madness with Shadow Word Death. Careful about its usage. Once you kind of break into that, like, I'm fighting 4 or 5 targets, it's really not worth it to do the Shadow Word Death sniping. It kind of depends on what you're doing, though. If there are 3 targets, though, kind of snipe one in a row each for that. That can be strong, especially if you're taking Death and Madness. Getting that Insanity generation, if you're kind of starved for Insanity, Death and Madness procs can really help you get a bit more to kind of help finish off the pack, so keep that in mind. So that's kind of the TLDR version of the rotation. Depending on how long we're sitting in pre-patch, I might do a whole guide just specifically for Mythic Plus, but that's all you really need to know from an AoE perspective on the Shadow Priest. All right, guys? All right, this has been a very long video. I apologize if you're still with me. Thank you so much. One quick caveat before I end. For the most part, SimC is going to be updated for pre-patch. So if you want to sim your character to really optimize yourself, go for it. You might find some things that contradict what I'm saying, and that's going to be kind of coming down to, again, be very careful how you're simming. Are you adding movement? Are you adding lots of targets? For the most part, everything in SimCity is supported. Just be very careful with things like the Lucid Miner effect or any kind of like sub APL optimizations for essences. Hasn't really been done. We're mostly hyper focusing on Shadowlands, so keep that in mind. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you guys appreciated it. Before we end, a big shout out to all the Patreons that are supporting me. They've been a super large help lately. I've gotten so much work done and could not have done it without their support, so thank you guys so much. And again, if you play more than Shadow Priest, I do kind of want a quick shout out. I've made weak ores for every class and spec in the game, so if you like the way that my weak ores look for Shadow, they look exactly the same for every other spec in the game. If you played anything else, check them out. Everything will be linked in the description below. Otherwise, guys, that's all we have for the pre-patch guide for Shadow. Look for more stuff coming soon and more guides coming with Shadowlands release. And again, if you haven't read it, the Icy Veins guide is linked in the description that I wrote. So any specific questions, check that first. Otherwise, ping me on Discord, ask the question in the comments, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.